All right. So you know by now that we on the morning show, Jared and Katie in the morning, are absolutely obsessed with Making a Murderer on Netflix, a docuseries that's been aired on Netflix. And just a quick recap, Jared, do you want to do a quick recap of Making a Murderer?
If you haven't seen it, the quickest one we can do is that there's a guy called Steven Avery. He was wrongfully convicted of rape and spent 18 years in prison. He gets out of prison, and a couple years later, he is arrested for a murder, which he says he did not commit, and is currently in prison.
And the co-defense for that trial was led by a man named Jerry Buting and also Dean Strand. On the phone joining us, we have Jerry Buting. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Greensboro.
Now, before we get into the Making a Murderer, you spent time in North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Is that correct?
I did, yes. I got my law degree there, and I've got family there. In fact, quick shout-out to my nieces and nephew, Tori, Sam, Luke, and Sierra, all in Greensboro.
Oh,
really?
Wow. Local ties.
I'll be following them on Facebook later. And so you hate Duke, is that correct?
Always.
Okay.
Very good. We just had to get that out of the way before we get into the really important stuff. The first question that I would have for you, Jerry, and first of all, thank you for taking time. I know you're busy.
Sure.
Is do you think currently today that Steven Avery is innocent?
I do, and I think that the documentary showed more than enough reasonable doubt of that. I mean, obviously, I wasn't there the day that he met Teresa Halbach. You know, really nobody knows for sure other than God and him. But there are just too many inconsistencies in the state's theory and in the evidence itself, and the lack of motive. Somebody who was about to come into a big payday like that, why? None of it just made sense to me.
And I've read recently, I've read a whole bunch of different things, but Ken Kratz, the prosecutor, who I think we view as a villain at this point, with the way he poisoned the jury pool by putting all the information out well before the trial had even started, keeps talking about things that were left out of the Netflix series. He talks about sweat DNA.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
What would your response be? Found under the hood latch? What would your response be to that?
Well, first of all, there were things left out of the defense case as well, and when you have a 6 to 8 week trial, you can't possibly include everything. What they did, I think, is they accurately covered all of the major pieces of evidence that both sides cared about and spent most of their time on. Now, this business of sweat DNA, there is no such thing as sweat DNA. It's Kratz is saying, what did they have, a vial of perspiration that they could plant as well? And in fact, there is no such thing as sweat DNA. It's a complete misnomer. There's DNA in all of our cells, or almost all of our cells, and it is sloughed off through skin and oils and various different ways, as well as being contained in our bodily fluids. But what Mr. Kratz ignored is that, first of all, his own expert testified they never did a test to rule out the presence of blood on the very small amount of DNA that was found on the hood latch. So it could easily have been the same source of blood or same source of DNA that was located elsewhere. But even perhaps more importantly is that another one of their analysts testified that he was inside the car when, where Steven's DNA had been found, and was wearing latex gloves, and then got out and opened up the hood latch, or hood by using the latch, with the same gloves without changing them.
Oh,
and
wow.
So it could easily have been innocent transfer by this other lab analyst. So it really, all of that was brought out in the trial, and it was pretty clear it wasn't a major factor in the case anyway.
Mm-hmm. Jerry, I know watching the documentary Making a Murderer on Netflix, we all have a sense, what we like to think, that we have a sense of what Steven Avery is like as a man. And we only know the things that we were shown on the docuseries. How would you describe Steven Avery as you knew him? What was he like? What don't we know?
Well, I think a fair amount about his lack of education, and he's a concrete thinker, and struggled with who and why somebody would do this to him, not just once but twice. And he was more, I guess maybe more naive than he should have been in filing this big lawsuit and expecting that there wouldn't be some kind of retaliation. And he maybe should have, as some of his family recommended, maybe he should have moved out of the area when that happened. But that was his life, and his family was there. So he, he's not a perfect human being. None of us are. But he was never a violent. He had no sexual assault history other than this wrongful conviction. He was never convicted of any other violent offenses before this. So it was an awfully large leap in anybody's mind to see this guy who had just spent so long wrongfully in prison, about to get a lot of money from one source or another, and to then go do something like this. And one of the things that didn't make sense with the state's case, they sort of alternate between that he was somehow some kind of criminal mastermind who was so clever and that he could wipe up every bit of evidence better than even a crime scene detective could do, and yet was somehow dumb enough to leave the woman's bones right 20 yards outside of his back door.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
And the car key.
None of it made sense.
Right.
And the car key. And I do have one question for you. This is Jason, by the way. What do you think is the hesitation, or why the denial of a retrial? Why do you think this judge is completely denying if there's significant doubt? The whole country thinks there's significant doubt of lack of evidence, and it certainly looks like there was definitely something suspicious going on with the police department or the county sheriff. Why are they denying in the retrial? Is the judge? Do you think there's something going on with the judge, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's really part of a much broader, much deeper problem in this country about our appellate system. And people think that, well, if a jury makes a mistake and they screw it up, the appellate courts will correct it and give them a do-over. But the reality is that the appellate courts very rarely reverse cases, and really they do what they can because of standards of review that have been built up over the years through common law and whatnot. They do what they can to affirm convictions, not do justice. So, and somebody on appeal has all of these obstacles and hurdles you got to get over before the court will even consider the merits of your argument. Procedural hoops you've got to jump through. And so, we find this in many cases, not just this, and in fact you saw it in Steven Avery's first wrongful conviction. The Court of Appeals turned a blind eye to all kinds of evidence that made it seem like the jury in that first case made a mistake. But they're not in the business of correcting jury mistakes. They only reverse cases when there are legal errors that were made, not factual mistakes or conclusions that the jury comes up with.
We're talking to defense attorney of Steven Avery, Jerry Buting. I appreciate you joining us. What would you say? I know you won't say because I've read some things with some interviews you've done, but do you have somebody that you think, I know you won't say who, think committed this crime? Is there some evidence that you've seen that would lead you to believe someone else committed this crime?
Well, that's one of the enduring mysteries is, who did kill this poor woman and why. And we were not allowed to present our theories or our evidence to the jury because of some crazy, in my mind, unfair pretrial ruling that was then affirmed once again on appeal. But we did have other suspects. There were other suspects multiple people who had the same access, the same opportunity to have done this as Steven Avery, and at least as much motive or more. which is to say, none. Nobody really knows. This woman didn't have any enemies that we know of. Didn't, not like she was someone who's had an abusive spouse or a business partner who was trying to, take over the business, and motive to kill that you might see in some cases. So nobody really has a clear-cut motive, and unfortunately, some of the way that the police investigated this case, they've now lost evidence that might have been available had they investigated it properly in the first place. So I'm not sure whether we'll ever know, for certain who did kill her. But I do think that there are other suspects out there, and there's some interesting theories on the internet and particularly on Reddit. I'm sure people can see about how things might have happened, and I can't endorse any particular one of those, but
you have some of your own
the very
personal.
fact that there are so many possible other theories of what happened and why and by whom is further indication of the reasonable doubt that there was in this case.
But do you have a personal belief? I know you're not going to share that, but do you have a personal belief that you think, I just as a forget being an attorney, that you think is probably these people or this person?
I've kind of gone back and forth over the years. At various times, I've thought it was more likely this particular person or not this particular person, and then things have happened, and some things happened in the middle of the trial that gave me pause and started thinking maybe it was this other individual involved, and so I can't really say that I'm wedded to any one at this point.
Got you.
Mm-hmm. Jerry, when you were just saying, over the course of the years, it brings up a thought for me is that, it's Making a Murderer, the docuseries, is so fresh on our minds as if it just happened yesterday. But in reality, it's been several years since the end of the trial. What was life like for you at the end of the trial until now? Everything, it's refreshed. It's brought back into the spotlight. What was that like for you?
Anytime you lose a serious case, it's difficult to accept and move on. This case, I think, was unquestionably the hardest for me to disengage and get back to my normal life and normal practice, because I really felt like there was such an injustice done. And it was it's really amazing how we were very well known and very recognized on the street, every place we'd go. The case got so much publicity and people knew who we were, but for the most part, we were the bad guys. We were the ones who were defending this person the state had made out to be a monster, and most of the public wasn't really paying attention to the individual witness testimony at the trial, unless you were watching it live online, and not that many people did. So it really wasn't until this documentary came out that suddenly people got to hear what the witnesses actually said in court from their mouths, not being filtered through, your 3-minute film at 11 that people would see on TV. That suddenly people realize, that we did a good job. We did as good a job as we could, and so now people are recognizing me again all over the place, and but it's a much more positive feeling certainly than it was back then.
Yeah, it's like you come full circle. You were villains, at least in the Wisconsin area at the time, and now you guys are like defense heroes across the country, which is kind of an interesting change or turn of events. I had a really good question. I just forgot it.
What? You want me to ask my question while you're thinking?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so you're saying now you're well known and everybody knows who you are. How do you feel? It's a little bit of a lighter note. How do you feel about being the internet heartthrobs? Every woman I've spoken to, and it's all over the internet, Jerry, that these women are having girl crushes on you and Dean. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's pretty funny, actually. Our wives say that they've known about that for years.
Right.
So long,
now they're worried.
Yeah.
Dean's got me beat 2-1, I think, on the internet votes on that. But it's humorous. I'm not quite sure what it is about our portrayal in the documentary that's provoked that kind of a response. But it's flattering. But really find even more gratifying is all of the young people that have written me that are, in college or in law school and say, this has really opened up my eyes about our system, and I really want to become involved. And, people who are really interested in becoming criminal defense attorney now, it's, I feel like happily we have portrayed a role model of a criminal defense attorney that's positive for a change instead of the sort of sleazy, unethical slime balls that are usually the way we're portrayed on
like
TV.
Ken Kratz as a prosecutor. That's just my opinion.
Hey, that's mine
yeah,
too.
that's the way we always used to be.
Yeah, he comes across that way. I did remember my question. My last question for you, real quick. In the Netflix series, Making a Murderer, you said there was a poll taken by the jury initially when the case closed that 7 out of the 12 jurors initially were wanting to vote not guilty. And then there was some swaying there, and there's been reports of some intimidation that's gone on. Some juror has come out recently, I guess anonymously, and said that they felt intimidated, and then they were swapping votes for different verdicts and all this different stuff. What do you know?
Well, I don't know much more than that, except to say that, in many, many cases, it's not unusual for a jury to sort of start off, and the first thing they do is sort of like take a straw vote. Let's see where we are. It's possible that everybody could be already unanimous agreement, and they wouldn't need to take any time at all, one way or the other. So, I was disappointed to hear that the not guilties were in the majority, but they all more or less got convinced, to change their votes and vote guilty on the homicide thing. It was weird that they found not guilty on the mutilation of a corpse count.
Yeah, we thought so.
Yeah.
And how you could accept the state's theory on the one but not on the other. Sounded like there might have been some sort of horse trading compromise. It did no benefit to Steven Avery because his penalty was just as bad for the one count. But I've never felt completely comfortable about the way the deliberations went down, and that there might have been some undue influence happening in some way or another. One of the national news weeklies apparently was able to contact most of the jurors, and sure enough, one of the ones who was so convinced of his guilt, when asked, well, why, what'd you base your verdict on, responded, well, he raped and tortured that poor woman. Teresa really suffered. And I thought, well, wait a minute, that was never presented as evidence in our trial.
Wow.
That was the whole false narrative that the state had presented through the Brendan Dassey so-called confession, and we were very ready to challenge that and to point out why that was a false confession, but they didn't call him in our case. So really at least that juror appears to have based his or her verdict on evidence that was never presented in court.
Which you're not supposed to do.
Yeah,
Wow.
that's fascinating.
Jerry, please don't sue us, but we do have one more question. I said one more question, but Jason Goodman has a question. We are talking to Jerry Buting, defense attorney for Steven Avery from Making a Murder, which is just taken pop culture by storm. Jason?
My question is, do you still stay in touch with Steven Avery, and if so, what are the conversations like?
Well, of course, no attorney can talk about what a client tells him or her because of attorney-client privilege. I have been in touch with Steven over the years, even though we stepped down as his attorneys right after the trial and appellate attorneys took over. And that's common because you want a fresh set of eyes. You want somebody who can look at the trial attorneys and see if we missed something or we made mistakes. And but then after his direct appeals were concluded, we still maintained contact over the years, sort of informally. And Dean and I did go see him the day before the documentary was released. We knew he wasn't going to be able to watch it in prison, but we wanted to sort of prepare him for what could have been the reaction one way or the other, not expecting it was going to be quite as big as it was. He does have a new attorney now who signed on from Chicago, talented attorney who's had success with other exonerations, and So she's assembling a team that's going to be trying to get him a new trial, and Dean and I will continue to assist in any way that they think is appropriate, but we're not actually his attorneys at this point.
Yeah, we talked to Sandy Greenman today, or actually yesterday. Was ex-fiance, but they're still friends.
Uh-huh.
And she said that she talked to him on Friday in prison, and said that he is more hopeful than ever since the Netflix documentary Making a Murderer has come out. So.
Yeah, and I would hope so. I mean, it's just the reaction has been very positive by and large, despite Mr. Kratz's efforts to try and push back. I think I'm optimistic that they're going to find legal grounds that'll be sufficient to get him a new trial, and then of course the challenge will be, can they find a jury that's really fair and impartial?
Right. It might be the opposite now. So many people have seen the thing, think he's innocent.
Innocent, yeah.
And then we never know. You just never know.
That's true. That may be a concern of the states as well, yeah. So
Well,
I expect they're going to fight tooth and nail to resist any effort to give him a new trial in part because of that. They're worried about all the negative backlash that people are having from seeing what really went on in this case.
Doesn't sound like the justice system, does it?
Nope.
All right. Well, Jerry Buting, we are so grateful for your time.
Thank you.
He has relatives here in Greensboro, went to UNC Chapel Hill, and was defense attorney for Steven Avery from Making a Murderer on Netflix. And you can follow him on Twitter. He didn't ask me to do this, but he actually, that's how I got in contact with him, at J Buting. All right, Jerry, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Have a good morning.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.